And welcome. And Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And I would say that the background of the laws that we're going to be reading about have to do with, I think, a very fundamental question, which is, whose body is it anyway? Do we in fact own our bodies? And what right of ownership does that mean? Or are our bodies actually on loan to us? And that actually, obviously, you know where I'm coming from. It's pretty obvious that we didn't create our own bodies, and therefore they are really somewhat to be treated as a loan and not as a present. Or if it's a present, it's a present that's going to be returned at some point or another. And I think even though the Torah doesn't necessarily any place that I can think of, or the Bible, say explicitly or deals with this question explicitly, nevertheless, I think it is there and it's understood that everything that we are is actually something that comes from somewhere else. And to have in consideration the fact that I don't own my body puts a lot of other issues onto it as well. And those are some of which are going to come out in the portions that we're dealing with now. And it also makes, for example, something like murder very different. When a murderer is destroying someone else, right? They're not just destroying that person, they're destroying something that came from God. That makes it even worse. It's bad enough as it is, makes it even worse. So with that in mind, I'm going to go into the screen share, and I hope it is helpful in terms of what we're actually going to be reading. Just wait a second while you can see it, and now you can. We actually left off, even though, as you can see, there's a paragraph here, right? We were talking about a situation where a man marries a woman who is understood to be a virgin at the time of that marriage, and he claims that she is not a virgin, that he did not find her tokens of virginity, whatever that actually means. And it says that essentially in the previous section that they witnessed to trial. I'm sorry, Golda?
She didn't bleed.
Okay.
That's the only thing I can come up with.
Okay. I'm not going to go there. At any rate, they take her parents take him and her, and they examine her. And if in fact she was these are false accusations. Interestingly enough, he can under no circumstances, at least according to the Torah law, divorce her. He will not be allowed to divorce her. So I guess she can treat him any way she likes. But at any rate, that is the one punishment. That's l'shalcha. That's what that is up there. I don't know if he has to pay a fine. He certainly has a bad reputation. Yep, he has to pay 100 pieces of silver to give to her father. I imagine that's a lot of money back in those times. So, and he is not allowed ever to divorce her. And it's possible that in knowing that, that would be a very serious warning to any man who was planning on that punishment might be a disincentive. All right, so that's one situation. And now we go to the other side of it. And let me say that this stuff is not easy. I do not expect you to be taking delight in what we're reading. It is simply there. And I think one attitude is to say, we're just scratching the surface and we shouldn't jump to conclusions. All right? At any rate, ve'im emet haya hadavar hazeh. But if in fact his accusation proves to be true, emet, if it's the truth, lo nimtza'u bitulim lana'ara, There were no tokens of virginity found in the young maiden. Interesting, by the way, that in the Torah it's spelt without the hey, and I wonder, I haven't come across yet an interpretation of why that in fact is the case. I'm sure such an interpretation or interpretations do exist in all the commentary that is out there, but at this point I cannot explain it other than to point it out. It's read Na'ara, right? It's understood. It's not read as Na'ar. Just interesting. So here we go. V'im emet haya hadavar. And if in fact this accusation was true, ba'edim b'hatra'ah, meaning, right? Meaning, and this is interesting because this takes us a little bit further. In other words, there were witnesses. In other words, by witnesses here, does Rashi mean people saw her engaged in unchaste practices? Hatra'ah, hatra'ah is forewarning, meaning they had told her, this happened understood, okay, that when she was about to commit this act of unchastity, she was warned that this could have a very damaging effect on her. And so this is the way to understand and to show evidence that she did it willfully and knowingly, that those two particular aspects are important, that she was conscious of the mistake she was making, or the violation she was taking. She knew she was doing it. La'achar irusin. That is, the point is this, Zanta lachar irusin, that this took place after she had been betrothed. So in other words, a man had proposed to a woman, the woman had agreed to become his wife, right? They had not actually gone through the marriage as yet, but she was in a state of betrothal, and she went and she had relations with another man. So giving you a picture of what's going on here. V'hotzi'u et, okay, they shall take out hana'ara el petach beit aviha, they should take the maiden to the entrance of her father's house, hear me out, uskaluha, and stone her, anshe ira ba'avanim v'ameta, that is to say, the men of her town should stone her with stones to death. V'ameta. Keep going. Ki asta nevala, because she has practiced obscenity by Yisrael in Israel. Liznot beit aviha. Rashi is going, even though it says the Hebrew is just really tortured here. Liznot is clearly a verb, right? So I'm translating it to act as a prostitute. Beit Aviha, her father's house. In other words, the Hebrew almost sounds like to turn her father's house into prostitution. But Rashi tells us we need to understand it as simply as to act as a prostitute in her father's house. Well, because being betrothed, she would still be in a situation of under her in her father's domain, which is going to actually show that the application, that the possible application of this law is very limited. Uvi'arta hara mikibecha, so that you should sweep away, utterly remove. That's what the vi'arta, it's actually related to a verb that also means to burn out, right? Cauterize the wickedness from your midst. So we know that one of the things that Micah says God requires of us is hatznea lechet, which means walking modestly. That the idea of being chaste, of being modest in our intimate relations is something clearly that the Torah is saying is an important issue. And we're back into that issue of the Torah, that the subtext of the Torah is doing what doesn't come naturally. So this is a very clear example, at least certainly in our present society, of such behavior. But again, I believe it's really reflective of an attitude that says, my body doesn't belong to me. I don't own my body. I'm responsible for my body. And that's different. So I said that what happens is that in the course of discussing these things, and the fact that it says na'ara and not isha, right? Or katana. So there are three stages in the development, in the legal development, should I say, of a woman. And of course, there's a lot of ink spilled into the actual application of this, but essentially from the year from birth until I believe it is 12, the age of 12, a woman is considered a minor. If I'm not mistaken now, because it's been a while since I've said it, David, I'll recognize you in just 2 seconds, but keep your hand up, it's fine. From 12 to 12 and a half, she is called a Nahara. She is that 6 month period, essentially. And from 12 and a half up, she is called a Bogeret, which means she is considered an adult. And since the Torah speaks of a Na'ara here, we're talking where these laws apply in terms of the punishments and things like that, only 6 months. And it's possible that the halacha considers that past the age of 12 and a half, as a Bogeret, there is not to be expected these signs of betulim. They're not expected. David, let me recognize you.
Yeah, so I was going to say in this whole thing, though, the man gets off scot-free. You know, the one that she had the relations with that she shouldn't have. She gets stoned to death, but the guy gets off scot-free. Is that what happens?
No, I would not say that. I just think that in this particular case, we are just dealing with a woman. We're not talking about what might happen to a man. There will be laws. I could say, hold on to your horses, because
Okay.
we're talking about a situation actually where the woman gets off and the man is punished. Okay? So we'll see. We'll see what the Torah has to say about it. But it's only because in order to try and say things as clearly as possible, the Torah is discussing this particular issue, this particular situation. And it's not to say that there aren't other situations that have legal ramifications in connection with this. And you've just brought out one of them. But we're not dealing with a man here. We're dealing with a husband and a betrothed woman. Okay.
Well, what I meant was, so the man who had relations with the betrothed woman,
Yes.
seems like, only the betrothed woman suffers in this case, not the that's what I was getting at.
No. I believe, in fact, that the man would be considered an adulterer, and the punishment for adultery is also a capital punishment.
Okay.
The difference isn't whether or not they are punished. The difference has to do with the nature of the punishment. I believe that the punishment for adultery is strangulation.
Oh, okay.
There are 4 different kinds of punishments that are capital punishments, just to review this, right? There's strangulation, there's decapitation, there is stoning, and there is burning. In all cases, again, not to jump to conclusions, they all, even though the way the Torah puts it doesn't necessarily sound like this, in actual fact, they were instantaneous. Every single one of these things was instantaneous. And if my memory is correct, initially it was preceded by strangulation. So that the punishment itself was more symbolic, and it may have had implications with regards to immortality. But it did not preclude the possibility that a person had fully paid for their sins and would in fact be able to achieve immortality.
Interesting. Thank you.
All right. Yes, there's so much to this. Let's take a look at Rashi. All right. Yes. So, Rashi in a way is fascinated with a, by the details that are here. In other words, the fact that they take this young woman, this maiden, to the entrance of her father's house. What significance is that? And he says, so here's what he's commenting on, right? El Petach Beit Aviha. And this is from Ketubot, Memhei, in other words, the tractate Ketubot, page 45. Re'u Gidulim Shegedaltem. In other words, and it's a sad commentary that her behavior doesn't take place, without anyone else being affected or having had anything to do with it. Literally, this means, in other words, this is a public display. See the growth that you raised. In other words, that people see that this is a house where children behave, or this child has behaved like this. And I think there is actually, to some extent, a natural sense that our reputation reflects on the reputation of our family. We don't act as individuals entirely, at least in terms of public opinion, in that court of public opinion. So, if I may be allowed a moment of a political reference, I would say that the behavior of our former president is actually far more a reflection on his father and how his father raised him. That never, ever escapes me. At any rate, okay. Why mention Anshe Ira, the men of her town? Remember, it says they Anshe Ira, the men of her town shall stone her with stones, etc. Okay. So it says Anshe Ira. Why that part of this halacha? This is taken from the Sifrei, and it says b'ma'amad. In other words, in a standing, and in other words, kol anshe ira, all the men of her town. So I believe when I looked at the Sefaria, and Lauren, you may have something else in your translation here, that presumably it usually is, because there are other places which say the hand of the witnesses shall act first. So whether, but it does say kol anshe ira, and maybe what Rashi is saying is that, that this is something that everyone has to witness. Lis not bnei aviha, and he says kamo beveit aviha, right there, right. In other words, to act as a prostitute in her father's house. Well, that's also part of the idea of a na'ara, because bogeret, right, somebody who is older than a na'ara, more than 12 and a half, is no longer, in a sense, beveit aviha. We'll take a little bit more, since I don't see any hands raised. But this is a new idea now, so perhaps this is a good place to stop for today. I think I will, because this is a new, same general subject, same general topic, but a different circumstance. Okay. Stop the share. Okay. All right. So, any comments before I stop the recording? Lauren, I'm sure you have some thoughts, putting you on the spot.
Well, actually, no, my thoughts were related to something that's not that related, but that you mentioned earlier. And it just, kind of set a little thought in motion but it's not really related to this topic. It's when you talked about murder. And so my mind was thinking about justified killing, which, would include, I guess, because, well, the murder, first of all, murder just is talking about people, because you talked about destroying God's creation, but when you kill, then this is what really threw my mind into this. Well, when you kill an animal, you're still destroying God's creation, but people do that to eat or to wear, or in some cases for fun. And So, but that doesn't have to be justified because it's an animal, even though it's God's creature. And then for people, I mean, I'm really anti-capital punishment and anti-war because I don't believe that those are legitimate reasons to kill, and I don't believe that they are solving problems. And I do believe that they cause problems. But self-defense, that's something different. And yeah, so I know that wouldn't be considered murder if you're trying to save your life or someone else's life. And but I do think that, like, again, as far as self-defense, there are probably ways that you can stop somebody from hurting you or someone else without killing them, but you may accidentally kill them. But I think if your point is to stop somebody by killing them, I think that's draconian. You can wound them in ways that will stop them, that won't murder them. And then my mind was also thinking about how you were taught, sometimes they say slander is a type of murdering of the soul, which is a little bit of a stretch, but I can understand. I mean, but if again, you always have to separate people out. That the other animals don't count, even though they are God's creatures, and they do appear to have, personalities and souls and intelligence and all of that.
Can I respond?
Oh yeah,
You've raised no, because you've raised a lot of wonderful
I
different
know.
points. So I do want to address the one about the animals, okay? So notice, okay, there are a bunch of things that in terms of some of the issues raised. One is that the first of all, look at the number of animals we are allowed to kill, to eat, to consume, right? It's very limited if you think about it, okay? Number two, the Bible makes it clear that prior to Noah, human beings were vegetarians. They did not have the right. I think your argument is well proposed, that it's still killing a creature of God. And it was only after Noah saved all those animals from death, which is in a sense, and interestingly enough, that it's in the context of a flood, but it's you know naval law, right, or maritime law, that if you salvage someone else's boat, it's yours, because the assumption is that boat would have gone. So if you salvage something, it's yours. And human beings, it's very explicit in the Torah that only after Noah saved the animals in the flood that they were permitted to eat meat.
But he saved non-kosher animals as well.
He's not Jewish, okay? Yes. So he
Oh,
is.
right.
But there are the Noahide laws. And by the way, I think exactly speaking to your point, Lauren, is the fact that that Ever min hachai, taking the limb of a living animal so that you can have fresh meat, okay, is forbidden, meaning every human being. The Noahide laws are applied to every human being, okay? So that's part of it. Another point that you are raising is sport killing, right? You know that it is absolutely not part of what is considered a Jewish tradition, and that hunting for sport is not considered appropriate. And not only that, the way in which we have to prepare the animal before we allow it to consume it in order to remove the blood, to make sure, hopefully, that it's killed as painlessly as possible, that you have to raise it yourself. Although when it comes to deer, okay, to deer meat, which is kosher, I'm not sure how exactly. The laws are slightly different there, but we know that with birds, you're not allowed to eat a wild bird. You have to domesticate the bird in order to be allowed to eat it. And I'm not sure if that in fact applies to deer as well. I just don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
But the animals don't have to be ritually slaughtered to use their leather or their feathers.
That may well be the case. I don't know. I just, I cannot speak with certainty. I know that in order to use, like, the tefillin are made out of leather, okay? The animal actually has to be a kosherly slaughtered, has to be a kosher animal to begin with, and it also has to be slaughtered kosher, and I believe, at what point, I'm not sure, possibly
And for
when
the
it's,
Torah too, for the
of
Torah
course,
scroll too.
absolutely, when it's flayed, in other words, prior to its being designated as to be used for tefillin or a Sefer Torah, it has to be done intentionally. In other words, the person about to do that has to say, I am flaying this animal, I'm preparing its skin, etc., for the sake of a mitzvah. And it may have to say the specific mitzvah. I'm not sure. These
But for the purpose of a jacket or shoes or a
I just
belt,
don't know. Right. I don't think so. I don't think it has to be. That's true. That's a good point that you're making. It may be an exceptional point. Okay. But the idea of not being cruel to an animal when killing it, I think is still very much, I think that comes into under the Aver Min HaChai principle, right? Not to cause the animal to suffer. That is the basic point about that. I'm trying to think. There were some other wonderful issues that you raised, which I believe I could answer, but I didn't make a note of them as you were saying them. So I'm sorry about that. And besides which, it's probably time for us to stop. But if you think about them and if you want to email them to me, I will try and deal with them. But I think they are dealt with in a way that might be more satisfactory. I mean, in general, the idea of, was one other thing. It's actually going to come up. They discuss in the Talmud whether, in order to save another person's life, are you allowed to kill the attacker? Now, allowed to kill the attacker takes into account your point about if you can wound the attacker and prevent that attacker from, pursuing their intent, of course. But the point is that what happens if you have no alternative but to kill the attacker? The fact that the Talmud even raises that as an issue, it's actually going to come up in the context of one of the laws that have to do with a man and a woman, and possible rape and things like that are coming up in a little bit. So it's interesting that that is actually a question that's asked. And with this, I'm going to stop the recording.